Have you ever heard of children so wild, so clever and so impossible, that grown adults ran out of their jobs in tears? I'm not talking about ordinary mischief. I'm talking about a pair of twin boys who managed to break every single nanny who dared to take care of them. And this happened not in some regular home, but in one of the richest mansions in the city. Their father was a powerful millionaire, a man who could control the world outside his gates but inside his home. He was powerless. The Kingsley mansion was a palace. White stone walls, golden gates, a fountain that sparkled in the sunlight. Inside, the floors were polished marble. Chandeliers glittered above every hall, and priceless paintings watched silently from the walls. Guests always gasped when they walked through those doors. But beauty can hide chaos. Edward Kingsley, the man who owned this mansion, was a legend in the business world. He could win deals that others thought impossible, build companies from nothing, and bend competitors to his will. People envied him. People feared him. Yet when it came to his 9-year-old twin boys, Edward was defeated. The twins were identical, blonde hair, blue eyes, sweet, angelic faces that fooled outsiders into thinking they were innocent. But the truth? They were nightmares in small bodies. Mischief wasn't just their hobby, it was their weapon. They didn't just act out. They studied people. They knew how to push buttons, how to break down walls of patience, how to make grown adults question their sanity. Nannies came in with confidence. They always believed they could handle the boys. "I've worked with difficult kids before," they would say. "Don't worry, Mr. Kingsley." It never lasted. One nanny quit after 3 hours, running down the driveway with her hair in disarray, tears streaming down her face. Another lasted 4 days but left screaming, "Those boys are demons!" A more experienced one, with a degree in child psychology, swore she would never work with children again after just a week. The mansion staff whispered about the boys like they were legends. "Nobody lasts here. The twins are impossible. You couldn't. Pay me enough to try." And Edward? He hated it. He could buy anything, solve anything except this. Money couldn't fix the fact that his children had become uncontrollable. Every failure, every departure of a nanny was like a wound to his pride. On a stormy morning, another nanny left. She had lasted less than a week. Edward stood in his study, staring out at the rain, whiskey glass in hand. His staff avoided his gaze. They had no new candidates left. No one wanted the job anymore. And then the doorbell rang. She wasn't what anyone expected. Mariah. She wasn't tall and intimidating. She wasn't young and cheerful. She wasn't dressed in polished nanny uniforms like the others. She wore a simple maid's dress. Her hands were rough from years of work. Her face carried lines of experience, of battles fought quietly. She had come to apply for housekeeping work, not childcare. But there was something in her presence, something calm, steady, unshakable. The butler hesitated before showing her in. Edward, desperate and out of options, studied her for a moment. When he learned she had taken care of children in her neighborhood, he sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "Let her try. She won't last a day anyway." And so it began. The twins spotted her first as she entered the grand hallway. They sat together on the staircase, identical grins spreading across their faces. They whispered to each other. "Bet she cries before dinner." "No," the other said with a smirk. "She'll quit before lunch." Mariah walked right up to them, her footsteps firm but unhurried. She didn't wear the nervous smile most adults did when meeting the twins. She didn't kneel down and try to win their affection. She simply looked at them with a gaze that was calm, strong, and unreadable. "So," she said, her voice warm but firm, "you must be the famous twins I've heard about." The boys grinned wider, expecting fear. "Do you know what happens to nannies here?" one asked. Mariah tilted her head slightly. "I've heard stories." She paused, then added, "But here's the thing, you don't scare me." For the first time, the twins blinked. Just a flicker, but it was there. Behind them, the butler almost choked. No one spoke to the boys like that. The twins quickly recovered, smirking again. "We'll see." Mariah smiled slightly, not sweetly, but knowingly. "Yes," she said softly. "We will." The staff whispered among themselves later that night. "She won't last. The boys will eat her alive. Nobody can survive them." But Mariah wasn't like anybody else, because behind her calm eyes, behind her steady voice, she carried a past full of pain and battles that made her stronger than anyone could guess. And that past was the reason she wasn't afraid. The twins thought they had found another victim. They had no idea they had just met their match. Imagine two kids so dangerous, not with fists, but with their minds, that they could make adults crumble. That's exactly what these twins did. Every nanny before Mariah had been their prey. But within just a few hours of her first day, she did something no one had ever managed. She turned the game back on them. The morning sun spilled across the polished marble floors of the Kingsley mansion. The house felt restless, like everyone inside was waiting for a bomb to go off. The butler whispered to the cook. The maids moved nervously through the halls. They had all seen this before. A new nanny, or in this case, a maid-turned-caretaker, was about to face the twins. Nobody lasted long. The staff knew it. The children knew it. The only person who didn't know yet was Mariah. The twins sat on the staircase whispering their bets. One leaned close to the other. She won't last until breakfast. No, the other said, his smirk sharper. She'll run before lunch. They had planned it already. They had tricks waiting, their usual weapons of chaos. Mariah entered the hallway with her sleeves rolled up, ready for work. She looked at the boys without fear. Her eyes were steady, her posture calm. Good morning, she said simply. The boys stared back, silence stretching between them. Then with a mischievous glint, one of them accidentally tipped over a vase. It crashed to the floor, water and flowers spilling across the marble. The sound echoed. Staff gasped. This was usually the moment of panic, the first crack in every nanny's armor. Mariah didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't rush to clean it up herself. She walked past the twins, fetched a towel, and came back. Without a word, she placed it in front of them. You made the mess, she said, her tone calm but firm. Now you clean it. The boys blinked. No adult had ever spoken to them that way. They expected yelling, punishment, or desperate pleading. But this was different. One of them scowled. We don't clean. Mariah folded her arms. Then the floor stays wet. And if anyone slips, that will be on you. For a long moment, it was a battle of stares. Finally, the other twin crouched down and began wiping the water. The first one, annoyed but unwilling to let his brother win, joined in. When they finished, Mariah smiled just a little. See, that wasn't so hard. The butler, watching from the corner, nearly dropped the tray he was holding. He had never seen such a thing. By mid-morning, the twins tried their second trick. They spilled orange juice all over the carpet in the breakfast room. This was their classic move, the one that always broke nannies. The carpet was expensive, delicate, impossible to clean. The sight of juice soaking into it had always made nannies lose control. Mariah walked in, looked at the spreading stain, then at the boys. Without hesitation, she left and returned with cleaning supplies. She handed the mop and sponge to them. Your mess. Your responsibility. The boys laughed. One grabbed the mop and swung it like a sword, sloshing juice everywhere, expecting her to explode. But she didn't. She stood calmly, arms crossed, waiting. You done? She asked when he finally stopped. Her voice was so steady, so sure, it disarmed him. The other twin sighed, knelt down, and began scrubbing. After a moment, his brother joined in. When the last bit of juice was gone, Mariah nodded. Good, now eat your breakfast. The staff exchanged looks of disbelief. It was impossible. Nobody had ever gotten the twins to clean up after themselves. And yet here they were doing exactly that. That evening, when Edward Kingsley returned home, he noticed something strange. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, he would walk into chaos, staff complaining, children screaming, something broken. But tonight, there was none of that. He found Mariah in the living room, calmly folding laundry while the twins played quietly on the rug nearby. Edward's eyes narrowed. They're behaving? Mariah didn't look up. They're capable of much more than people think. They just need someone who doesn't play their game. The twins glanced at their father, then back at Mariah. For once, they didn't try to deny it. They didn't run wild or shout. They just kept playing, as if the presence of this new woman had shifted the rules. Edward studied her, his sharp eyes skeptical. Don't get comfortable, he warned. They'll break you. They always do. Mariah met his gaze. We'll see, she said, her voice even. Upstairs, As the boys prepared for bed, they whispered to each other. Their smirks had faded, replaced by something else. Curiosity. "She's different," one admitted. "Yeah," the other agreed reluctantly. "But she won't last." Still, neither of them sounded as certain as before. Because deep down, for the very first time, the twins had felt something unusual. Respect. Everyone thought the twins were just spoiled brats who loved chaos. But Mariah was about to uncover something no one else had ever noticed. Truth hidden behind their mischief. And once she saw it, nothing inside that mansion would ever be the same again. The next morning started with the usual hush that filled the Kingsley mansion whenever a new caretaker was around. Staff tiptoed through hallways, whispering bets on how long Mariah would last. They'd seen this pattern 100 times before. First day, the twins tested boundaries. Second day, they doubled the chaos. By the third, the nanny usually snapped. But Mariah wasn't like anyone before. She started her day in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee while the cook stared in disbelief. "You're calm," the cook said carefully. "Most don't make it this far without crying." Mariah smiled lightly. "Children are children, no matter how rich or wild they are. Not these ones," the cook muttered, shaking her head. And almost on cue, the twins made their entrance. Dressed in identical button-up shirts, their blonde hair messy from sleep, they wore the same mischievous grins. Today, they weren't planning to spill juice or break vases. No, today's plan was bigger. They had snuck into their father's office, the one place forbidden to everyone. His desk was a fortress of contracts and files worth millions. His leather chair was sacred, his fountain pens neatly lined. The boys had turned it into a battlefield. Papers scattered across the carpet. Pens snapped in half, ink smeared on the armrest. When Mariah walked in, she stopped at the doorway. Most nannies would have gasped in horror. Some would have screamed. Others would have rushed to clean up the mess before Edward returned. That's exactly what the twins expected. Instead, Mariah walked slowly into the room, her face unreadable. She looked at the destroyed office, then at the twins, and folded her hands calmly. "Do you know what I see?" she asked. The twins smirked. "What?" "I see two boys wasting their brilliance. Anyone can destroy. But real strength? Real intelligence? That's in fixing things." The twins exchanged a look. That wasn't the reaction they expected. They wanted panic. They wanted fear. But Mariah had turned it into a challenge. One of them sneered. "We don't fix." Mariah tilted her head. "Then maybe you're not as smart as I thought." That stung. The twins hated being underestimated. Slowly, one of them bent down, gathering papers. The other, not wanting to be left behind, joined him. They didn't do a perfect job. The papers were bent, the ink stain permanent. But by the time they finished, the office looked less like a battlefield and more like a room again. Mariah nodded. "Better." The butler, who had been peeking nervously through the crack in the door, nearly dropped his jaw. He whispered to another maid. They actually cleaned, voluntarily. That evening, Edward returned. He entered his office, expecting perfection, and froze at the sight of slightly crooked stacks of paper and faint ink marks. His sharp eyes flicked to the twins. "We did it," one of them admitted quickly before his father could even ask. Edward raised his brows. His sons never confessed, not once in 9 years. He glanced at Mariah, who stood silently in the corner. Something about her calm presence unsettled him. Later that night, Mariah sat with the twins in the playroom. She didn't scold them, didn't lecture them. She just sat on the rug while they built a messy tower of blocks. Silence stretched between them until one of the boys finally spoke. "People always leave anyway." Mariah's heart tightened. The words were quiet but heavy. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The twins shrugged, eyes fixed on the blocks. "Nannies, maids, everyone, they always leave." Mariah studied their small faces. The mischief, the cruelty, they weren't born from nothing. They were shields, layers of defense against the pain of abandonment. No one had ever stayed long enough to see the truth behind the chaos. Mariah leaned forward, her voice gentle but strong. "Well, I'm not everyone. I don't scare easy, and I don't run." The twins looked at her then, not with their usual smirks, not with mischief, but with something deeper. Curiosity. Hope, maybe. But also fear of disappointment. They quickly turned away, hiding behind laughter. "You'll quit," one said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Yeah," the other added. "They all do." Mariah just smiled faintly. We'll see. That night, as the mansion grew quiet and the boys drifted off to sleep, Mariah stood at their doorway watching them breathe. Behind their angelic faces, she now saw the cracks. The chaos wasn't just bad behavior, it was a cry that no one had ever taken seriously. And Mariah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. For years, the millionaire Edward Kingsley believed no one could handle his sons. They were his greatest unsolved problem. But after just a few days, with Mariah, something began to shift. And Edward, a man who trusted only in power and money, found himself noticing the one thing neither of those could buy: respect. The fourth day in the Kingsley mansion felt different. Usually mornings began with shouting, the sound of something breaking, and staff scurrying around in panic. But now, there was silence. A calm silence no one trusted yet. The maids walked quietly through the halls, exchanging nervous glances. At breakfast, Edward entered the dining hall expecting the usual chaos. Juice on the table, boys refusing to eat, cutlery scattered across the floor. But instead he froze at the sight before him. The twins were seated, plates of food in front of them. Not perfectly behaved, but not screaming either. One boy tapped his spoon on the table. The other poked at his eggs. But both were still in their chairs. And Mariah? She stood nearby, sipping tea, not hovering anxiously like the others before her. She didn't plead, didn't scold. She just was. Edward narrowed his eyes. They're sitting? Mariah glanced at him. Children eat better when no one makes it a war, she said simply. The boys exchanged smirks. But it wasn't the same smug look as before. It was quieter, less defiant. Edward took his seat unsettled. For years, breakfast had been a battlefield, and now it looked almost normal. By midday, the twins had decided they weren't going to make things too easy. They planned another trick. They slipped into the mansion library, a room lined with leather-bound books and antique globes. Mariah found them balancing on ladders, tossing books down like confetti. One of the twins laughed as a thick volume hit the rug with a thud. Careful, she said calmly, stepping inside. Some of these books are older than your great-grandparents. Then they're boring, one twin snapped, tossing another to the floor. Mariah didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush forward in panic. Instead, she walked slowly to one of the fallen books, picked it up, and opened it. Did you know, she said, flipping pages, that this one has stories about men who explored the world? Seas, mountains, deserts. They went places no one had ever seen. The twins hesitated, glancing at each other. Curiosity flickered, but pride kept them quiet. Mariah kept reading aloud, her voice steady. Within minutes, one of the twins climbed down from the ladder. Wait, he muttered. What happens next? The other twin quickly followed, trying not to look interested, but inching closer all the same. Mariah smiled faintly and continued reading, letting the adventure unfold. By the time she closed the book, the boys were sitting cross-legged on the rug, listening quietly. For the staff peeking in from the hallway, it was a miracle. The same boys who once used books as weapons were now sitting still for a story. That evening, Edward noticed the difference again. He returned from a long day of meetings, expecting the usual complaint. Reports. Instead, the butler said cautiously, Sir, the boys spent the afternoon in the library. Edward froze. Reading? Listening, the butler corrected. To Mariah. Edward strode into the living room, where he found the twins still sitting quietly with a book between them. Mariah was folding laundry nearby, calm as ever. Edward's sharp voice cut through the room. What is happening here? The boys glanced at him, then shrugged. She read us a story. Edward's brows shot up. His sons hated stories. They never sat through a single one. And you listened? The twins exchanged a look, then muttered, Maybe. Mariah didn't defend herself, didn't boast. She simply said, Sometimes. Children just need someone who doesn't give up on them. Edward studied her for a long moment. This woman was different, and it unsettled him. He was a man who believed in contracts, negotiations, strategies, but Mariah wasn't doing any of that. She was just being steady, and it was working. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He crossed his arms. Don't think this means you've won them. They'll push harder. They always do. Mariah met his gaze without fear. Then I'll push back. I'm not here to win. I'm here to stay. Edward was silent. Nobody had ever spoken to him that way, not staff, not nannies, not even his business associates. For the first time, he wondered, had he underestimated her? Later that night, the twins whispered in their room. She's weird, one muttered. She doesn't yell. She doesn't cry, the other replied. Maybe she's just pretending. They all break eventually, but even as they said it, their voices lacked the sharp certainty they once carried. Deep down, they were starting to wonder, what if she really was different? Mariah, standing just outside their door, heard every word. She smiled faintly to herself, because she knew, brick by brick, wall by wall, the cracks in their defenses were beginning to show. And for the first time in years, the mansion wasn't ruled by chaos. It was ruled by something far stronger, patience. By now, the twins had thrown every trick they knew at Mariah, spilled juice, broken rules, even destroyed their father's office, and somehow she never cracked. But the boys weren't finished. They had one last test, the one that had always sent every nanny running for good. What they didn't know was that this time their challenge would backfire. The Kingsley mansion had changed. For the first time in years, the staff moved without fear. Breakfast didn't sound like war. Evenings didn't end in screaming. But peace never lasted long with the twins. On the fifth day, whispers spread through the mansion. The boys were planning something big. The butler heard them sneaking around at dawn. The cook found the pantry door left open, jars missing. Something was coming. Mariah noticed it too. She could feel it in the way they kept exchanging secret glances, their whispers halting whenever she walked in. But she didn't press them. She let them think she wasn't paying attention. By noon, the plan revealed itself. The twins had decided to unleash chaos at dinner, Edward's sacred hour. Every evening, he returned exhausted from meetings, expecting food on the table. Even when the boys misbehaved, Edward demanded his ritual, a perfect meal. The twins saw it as the ultimate weapon. If they could destroy dinner in front of their father, they could finally get rid of Mariah. That evening, the dining hall glowed with golden chandeliers. A long table stretched across the room, silver cutlery lined neatly, crystal glasses sparkling. Edward entered with his usual commanding presence. Still in his dark tailored suit, tie slightly loosened after the day. Mariah stood quietly in the corner, supervising as the twins took their seats. She already sensed the storm. The first move came quickly. One twin accidentally knocked over a glass of water. It spilled across the tablecloth, seeping toward Edward's plate. Edward's jaw clenched. Careful. The boy smirked, unfazed. Mariah calmly handed him a napkin. You know what to do. The boy frowned but began blotting the spill. His brother, annoyed that the plan was already faltering, escalated. He grabbed the bowl of mashed potatoes and tipped it onto the table with a loud plop. Gasps filled the room. The staff froze. Edward slammed his hand on the table. Enough, he barked. His voice echoed like thunder. The twins grinned. This was what they wanted. Anger, shouting, the chaos that always ended with the nanny's failure. But Mariah didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Boys, clean it up. The twins laughed. No? Edward's face turned red. Mariah, this is unacceptable. But before he could finish, Mariah raised her hand slightly, not at him, but toward the boys. Her eyes never left theirs. You wanted to ruin dinner. You thought it would be funny. But do you know what's really funny? You're going to fix every bit of it before anyone eats. The twins' smiles faltered. Nobody had ever dared to cut through their father's rage like that. Mariah's tone sharpened. Now, towels, mop, go. The staff stared in stunned silence. Edward leaned back in his chair, watching. Part of him wanted to interfere, but something held him still. He wanted to see what she would do. The twins hesitated, but Mariah didn't blink. Her calm was stronger than their defiance. Finally, one of them slid off his chair, grumbling. The other followed. Together they fetched towels and began cleaning the mess. It was clumsy, messy, and slow. They dropped a fork, argued, tried to sneak away, but each time, Mariah's steady voice pulled them back. Not finished. Keep going. By the time they were done, the dining table was far from perfect, but it was clean. Their little faces flushed, their energy drained. Mariah nodded. Better. Then she looked at Edward. Now dinner can continue. Edward stared at her. speechless. No one had ever taken control of his sons in front of him like that. Not staff, not teachers, not even himself. The twins sat down again, silent for once. They picked at their food, no smirks, no laughter. Something had shifted. After dinner, Edward followed Mariah into the hallway. His voice was low, edged with suspicion. How did you do that? Nobody has ever gotten them to obey like that. Not me, not anyone. Mariah folded a napkin, unfazed. Children act out when they think no one is strong enough to stay. But strength doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means being steady, showing them you're not going anywhere. Edward studied her. He didn't like being impressed, but he couldn't deny it. This woman, this maid, was succeeding where money and prestige had failed. Don't think you've won them over, he said sharply, more to protect his pride than anything. They're unpredictable. They'll test you again. Mariah looked him straight in the eye. Then I'll be ready. For a long moment, they just stood there, two very different people, one powerful by wealth, the other by quiet resilience. And though Edward would never admit it out loud, for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Upstairs, the twins whispered in their room. She made us clean the table, one muttered angrily. And in front of Dad, the other added, scowling. No one ever does that. They were frustrated, embarrassed. But beneath that, there was something else, something they didn't want to name. Respect. She's different, one finally said. Yeah, the other admitted softly. She didn't break. Neither of them could sleep easily that night. For the first time, their game had failed, and they couldn't stop thinking about the woman who refused to leave. Mariah, sitting by her small window in the staff quarters, knew the truth too. The twins were running out of tricks. The walls around their hearts were starting to crumble, and little by little they were learning that chaos wasn't power. Love was. Everyone thought the twins were just spoiled brats, unruly, cruel, impossible to tame. But chaos is rarely born from nothing. And one night, when the mansion was quiet and the world outside slept, Mariah stumbled into the truth. The twins weren't just acting out. They were hiding a secret no one had cared to see. It was a rainy night at the Kingsley estate. The kind of night when the windows rattled and thunder rolled across the sky. Most of the staff had gone to bed early, grateful for a brief calm. Mariah, however, was still awake. She sat by the small desk in her quarters, folding laundry by lamplight. She was tired but alert. Her instincts told her the boys were restless. Sure enough, a soft sound broke through the storm. Not the loud crashing of another prank, not the sharp laughter of mischief. This sound was different. It was muffled, fragile, crying. Mariah rose quickly and followed it down the hall to the twins' bedroom. She pushed the door open quietly, and what she saw stopped her. One twin was curled up in bed, shaking with sobs. The other sat on the floor, head buried in his knees, trying to muffle his tears. Mariah's heart clenched. These weren't the faces of spoiled little tyrants. These were children in pain. She stepped inside. Boys! Both heads snapped up instantly, their masks snapping back into place. The sobbing turned into snarls. Go away, one spat. We don't need you, the other added, wiping his wet cheeks roughly. Mariah didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply sat down on the floor near them, close enough to be present but not too close to threaten. I heard you, she said softly. And I'm not leaving. The twins glared, but their eyes betrayed them. Fear, grief, loneliness. They had been carrying it all under the mask of mischief. Minutes ticked by in silence, broken only by the storm outside. Finally, one of the boys whispered, barely audible. She left. Mariah tilted her head gently. Who left? Our mom, the other twin blurted suddenly, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. She left us. Mariah's chest ached. That was it. That was the wound no one had seen. The first boy clenched his fists. Dad never talks about her, ever. He just works and buys things and hires people to deal with us. But no one stays. Tears spilled again, and for the first time, Mariah saw the truth behind the chaos. Their rebellion wasn't about power. It was about pain. She didn't rush in with empty comfort. She didn't say, I understand, because she knew she couldn't fully. Instead, she reached out, slow and steady, placing her hand gently on the rug between them, not touching, not forcing, just an anchor. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you've been carrying that alone. The boys blinked at her, startled. No one had ever said that. Not their father. Not the staff. Not anyone. And slowly, hesitantly, one of them scooted closer, his small hand brushing hers. The other followed as though afraid to be left out. Mariah's heart broke a little, but she stayed steady. They needed strength more than pity. "You don't have to fight me," she said softly. "You don't have to fight the world. You're allowed to be sad. You're allowed to miss her." The boys looked at her as though she had spoken a language no one had ever taught them. Later that night, after they had finally drifted to sleep, Mariah stood by their beds, watching their tear-stained faces soften in slumber. She tucked the blankets around them and whispered to the quiet room, "You're not impossible. You're just hurt." As she stepped out into the hallway, Edward was there. He had been standing in the shadows, listening. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, cold eyes that usually betrayed nothing, were wet. "You heard?" Mariah asked gently. Edward nodded slowly. For a moment, the powerful millionaire looked like just a man who had lost his wife, a man who didn't know how to raise two broken-hearted boys. "I didn't know," he admitted hoarsely. "I thought if I just gave them everything else, they wouldn't notice she was gone." Mariah shook her head. "Children don't need everything, Mr. Kingsley. They just need someone who stays." Edward swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. The truth was right there in front of him, in the tear. Stains on his son's pillows, in the exhaustion on Mariah's face, in the silence of his own guilt. He finally whispered, "And you stayed." Mariah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was written all over the house. For the first time, someone had stayed. The next morning, the twins were quiet at breakfast. Not sullen, not plotting, just quiet. They ate their food without throwing it. They glanced at Mariah often, as if checking to make sure she was still there. She smiled at them gently each time, and each time. Their small shoulders relaxed a little more. Edward noticed it too. For years, the table had been filled with battles. Now there was a fragile peace, and it wasn't because of money, tutors, or punishments. It was because of her. Mariah wasn't just keeping the boys in line, she was healing them. That night, Edward found himself outside Mariah's door again. He hesitated before knocking. When she opened it, he looked almost uncomfortable. "Thank you," he said gruffly, as though the words burned in his throat. Mariah tilted her head. For what? For seeing them. For hearing them. For staying. For a moment, the cold businessman and the quiet maid simply stood there. Two people who couldn't have been more different. And yet, in that instant, Edward realized something he had never admitted before. Money couldn't fix his sons. Power couldn't heal them. But maybe, just maybe, love could. And Mariah was the first person who had given them that in a very long time. Edward Kingsley had built empires, crushed rivals, and commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. But in his own home, he had been powerless. Now, for the first time, he found himself watching, not as a tycoon, not as a boss, but as a father. And the person who made that possible wasn't him. It was the maid he once dismissed. The days after that stormy night felt different inside the mansion. The air carried a quiet the staff hadn't known in years. No screaming matches, no broken glass, no desperate footsteps chasing after the twins. At breakfast, Edward sat at the head of the table, his paper open but unread. His sharp eyes kept drifting to the side where his sons sat. They weren't perfect. They still squirmed, whispered, and sometimes dropped crumbs all over the rug, but they stayed in their seats. They ate, they laughed. Mariah sat nearby, sipping her tea with the calm of someone who belonged. And Edward noticed something unsettling. His boys looked at her more than they looked at him. When one twin spilled orange juice, he didn't shout or cover it up. He looked at Mariah. She gave him a small nod, and he reached for a napkin and cleaned it himself. Edward lowered his paper. He wasn't used to this. Discipline had never worked. Tutors had failed. But one nod from Mariah carried more weight than any threat Edward had ever made. Later that week, Edward arrived home early, something he almost never did. The mansion was unusually quiet. Curious, he followed the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. He stopped at the doorway of the playroom. Inside, Mariah was kneeling on the carpet, helping the twins build a massive castle out of blocks. The boys were actually cooperating, handing pieces back and forth, arguing playfully instead of tearing each other down. Mariah's laugh filled the room. It wasn't loud or forced. It was warm, real. The kind of sound Edward hadn't heard in this house since his wife had been alive. For a moment, he just stood there, unable to move. The image struck him harder than any deal he had ever made. His son smiling, laughing, alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. Then one of the boys noticed him. "Dad, look, we built a castle!" Edward blinked, startled. His sons almost never called him like that. Usually they avoided him, hid from his stern presence. But now they were proud, eager to show him something. He stepped inside slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "A castle?" he repeated, trying to sound casual. Mariah glanced up at him, her eyes calm as always. Yes, and they didn't knock it down this time. The twins grinned, puffing out their chests. Edward crouched down awkwardly, his expensive suit bending in ways it wasn't made to. He looked at the castle. It was crooked, leaning to one side, but it stood. "It's impressive," Edward admitted, his voice softer than usual. The boys beamed. Mariah's smile deepened, but she didn't take credit. She let the moment belong to them. That night, Edward couldn't stop thinking about it. He sat in his study, staring at documents, but seeing only Mariah kneeling on the carpet, his sons laughing beside her. He realized something uncomfortable. He was jealous. Not of her exactly, but of the way his children looked at her. Like she was home. He had given them everything money could buy. Tutors, toys, trips, but none of it mattered. Because he hadn't given them what they truly needed. Presence, love, patience. And Mariah, a woman with no wealth, no power, no pedigree, had given them all of that without asking for anything in return. The next day, Edward tested it himself. He called the twins into his study. Normally, they hated it in there. The dark wooden shelves, the intimidating desk, the suffocating silence. But this time, they shuffled in without too much protest. "I want to talk," Edward began stiffly, clearing his throat. "About your behavior." The boys exchanged glances. Normally, this would end in lectures or punishments. But Edward was trying something different. He thought of Mariah, how she sat calmly, how she never forced, but always stayed. "You've improved," he said finally. The word felt foreign on his tongue. "I've noticed. You've been listening more, trying more." The twins fidgeted, unsure how to respond. Praise wasn't something they often heard. Edward exhaled. "I want you to know, I'm proud of that." The boys stared at him wide-eyed. For a moment, Edward wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then one of them whispered, almost in disbelief, "Really?" Edward nodded. "Really?" The silence that followed was fragile but powerful. The twins didn't grin or boast. They just stood there, processing words they had longed to hear but never expected. Mariah, standing quietly in the doorway, saw the moment unfold. She didn't speak, didn't interfere. But her eyes softened. Because for the first time, Edward Kingsley wasn't just a wealthy man trying to control his sons. He was trying to connect with them. That evening, Edward found Mariah in the garden. She was trimming roses, her hands gentle but firm on the thorns. "You've changed them," he said simply. Mariah looked up. "No, they've always been good boys. They just needed someone to see it." Edward stepped closer. The late sunlight caught in his sharp features, softening them just a little. "You don't give yourself enough credit." Mariah shrugged. "I'm not here for credit. I'm here for them." Edward studied her for a long moment. He wasn't used to people who didn't want something from him. In his world, every gesture had a price. But Mariah's didn't. She wasn't staying for money or status. She was staying because she cared. And that realization unsettled him more than anything. For the first time in years, Edward Kingsley, the man who believed he could buy the world, began to wonder if there were some things money could never touch. And those things were standing right in front of him, his sons, and the woman who had healed them. The Kingsley mansion had finally found peace, or at least the beginning of it. But peace never lasts without being tested. And when the crisis came, it wasn't just the twins who were pushed to the edge. It was Edward. And in that moment, he realized that the woman he once saw as just a maid had become the anchor of his entire world. The morning began like any other. The boys ate breakfast without throwing food. The staff moved quietly, relieved at the newfound order in the house. Edward read his paper, though more often than not. He found himself glancing over the edge at his sons and at Mariah, who sat with them like she'd always been there. But by midday, the calm was shattered. It started with a cough, a rough, sharp sound from one of the twins. At first, Mariah thought nothing of it. Children caught colds all the time. But within hours, the cough deepened, joined by a fever that spread quickly from one boy to the other. By late afternoon, both twins were pale, shivering, their small bodies weak against the bedsheets. The mansion erupted in panic. The butler ran for the doctor, the cook prepared broth, the staff whispered frantically in the halls. Edward stormed into the room, his usual control slipping. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fear. Mariah was seated between the two beds, a cool cloth in each hand, pressing them gently to the boys' foreheads. Her calmness was the only thing holding the room together. "They've caught a fever," she said softly. "The doctor is on his way." Edward clenched his fists. Why wasn't I?" He stopped himself, his words crumbling under the weight of his fear. Mariah looked at him steadily. "What matters now is that they feel safe." Edward swallowed hard. His sons, usually wild with energy, lay still and fragile. Their eyes fluttered open only to search for Mariah. One whispered, "Don't leave." Mariah smoothed his hair back. "I'm right here." And Edward realized with a pang that they hadn't looked for him. They hadn't called for their father. They had called for her. The hours stretched painfully. The doctor arrived, checked the boys, and assured Edward it was nothing life-threatening, just a harsh fever that needed rest and care. But even with that reassurance, Edward couldn't shake the tightness in his chest. He stayed in the room, pacing, restless. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. In business, he always had solutions, strategies, control. But here, with his sons burning with fever, he had nothing. Meanwhile, Mariah remained at their side. She fed them spoonfuls of broth when they stirred, whispered soothing words when they tossed in their sleep, wiped their foreheads when the heat spiked. She never once complained of exhaustion, though Edward could see the weariness in her eyes. At one point, he muttered, "You should rest. Let one of the staff take over." Mariah shook her head firmly. "They don't want anyone else. They need someone who won't leave." Edward had no answer. He sank into a chair in the corner, watching her. For hours, he just watched. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. He had hired her to manage chaos, but she was doing something far greater. She was holding his family together when he couldn't. She was the strength. His sons leaned on, the calm in the storm. For the first time, Edward admitted to himself what he had been denying. His respect for Mariah had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't name yet, but it was there, undeniable. By the second night, the fevers began to break. The boys' breathing steadied, their skin cooled. Relief washed over the mansion. Edward, who had barely slept, stood in the doorway watching as both boys finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. Mariah sat beside them, her head resting lightly against the bed frame, exhaustion finally claiming her. In the soft glow of the lamplight, Edward saw her not as the maid, not as the employee, but as the heart of his home. Quietly, he stepped closer and pulled a blanket over her shoulders. For once, the powerful millionaire didn't think about deals, status, or control. He just thought about how much his world had changed because of her, and how much he didn't want to lose her. The next morning, the twins woke weak but smiling. Their first words were for Mariah. "You stayed." She smiled faintly, brushing their hair back. "Of course I did." Edward stood behind her, his throat tightening. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to tell her what she meant. But the words didn't come. For a man who could command an empire, speaking, his heart suddenly felt like the hardest thing in the world. So instead, he simply met her eyes. And in that quiet exchange, more was said than words ever could. Later that day, when the mansion finally returned to calm, Edward walked alone in the garden. He needed space, air, clarity. But all he found was the same thought circling in his mind. Mariah had become more than the woman who tamed his sons. She had become the woman who tamed him. Edward Kingsley had conquered boardrooms, commanded armies of lawyers, and built an empire from nothing. But standing in his own mansion, watching his sons cling to the maid who had done the impossible, he realized he was facing the greatest battle of his life, not with rivals, not with money, with his own heart, and this time he couldn't afford to lose. The mansion was quiet again. The twins, now recovering from their fever, played in the garden with wooden swords, their laughter drifting through the open windows. The sound was light, free, the kind of joy Edward hadn't heard in years. He stood at his study window, hands behind his back, staring out at them. They were different now, softer, kinder, not perfect, not angels, but boys. His boys. And all because of her, Mariah. He found himself saying her name in his mind more often than he liked. The maid he had hired reluctantly, the woman he had doubted, the outsider he thought wouldn't last a week. She had done what he could not. She had given his sons back their childhood, and she had given him something too. A glimpse of the man he might have been if he hadn't buried himself in work and pride. But Edward Kingsley wasn't a man who wore his heart openly. He didn't know how to confess feelings, how to risk vulnerability. He knew contracts, negotiations, deals, not love. Still, as the days passed, the truth gnawed at him. He could no longer look at Mariah without feeling it, the pull, the respect, the warmth. And for a man who had always believed money could buy anything, it terrified him to realize this was the one thing money couldn't touch. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the mansion in gold, Edward found Mariah in the library. She was reshelving books with the twins' help, or rather, trying to reshelve them while the boys turned every step into a game. "Higher, Mariah!" one shouted, stacking books in a wobbly tower. "You're going to knock it." "Over," she warned, her tone firm but playful. Sure enough, the tower crashed, sending the boys into fits of laughter. Mariah shook her head, but her smile betrayed her amusement. Edward leaned against the doorway, watching. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, letting the warmth of the scene seep into him. Finally, when the boys darted off to chase each other, he spoke. "You've changed this house." Mariah looked up, startled to see him. "It wasn't me. It was them." Edward stepped into the room, his voice low, steady. "No, it was you. You saw them when no one else did. You stayed when no one else would." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head gently. "I didn't do it alone. You've tried too, Mr. Kingsley. You love them. They just needed time to feel it." Edward swallowed. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so plainly, yet he found he wanted more of it. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, he said the words that had been clawing at him for days. "I don't just respect you, Mariah. I admire you, more than I can say." Mariah blinked, caught off guard. She searched his face, unsure if this was another one of his calculated speeches. But there was no calculation here. Only truth. Edward stepped closer. His voice dropped lower, almost vulnerable. "You've done the impossible. You healed my sons. You healed this house. And God help me, you've changed me too." Mariah's breath caught. She wasn't expecting this. Not from him. Not from the man who once looked at her like she didn't belong. "Mr. Kingsley," she began, but he cut her off, his eyes burning into hers. "Edward," he said. "To you, I want to be Edward." For a man who lived behind titles and power, it was the most intimate thing he could give. Just then, the twins came racing back into the room, laughing wildly. They crashed into Mariah, hugging her legs, then turned to their father. "Dad, Mariah says we're getting better at building castles," one shouted. "And she didn't even have to yell at us," the other added proudly. Edward chuckled softly, a sound so rare that the staff peeking from the hallway nearly gasped. He knelt down to his son's level. "She's right. You're getting better, because she believed you could." The boys glanced at Mariah, their eyes full of admiration. Then, in unison, they said the words Edward never thought he'd hear. "Don't let her leave." Edward froze. His gaze flicked to Mariah, who looked equally stunned. The twins hugged her tighter. "Promise us, Dad. Don't let her go." Edward's throat tightened. Slowly, he rested a hand on each of their shoulders. "I promise." Mariah's eyes widened. She hadn't agreed to stay forever. But the way Edward said it, firm, certain, left no room for doubt. In that moment, she realized something too. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was a home. That night, when the twins were asleep, Edward found Mariah in the garden. The air was cool, the roses faintly fragrant. The moonlight bathed everything in silver. He stood beside her, hands in his pockets, searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke. I don't know what the future looks like, he admitted. I don't know how to be this, but I know one thing. I don't want this house to go back to what it was before you came. And I don't want to go back either. Mariah turned to him, her eyes steady, calm. You're saying a lot for a man who usually says nothing. Edward gave a small, almost nervous laugh. Then let me say the one thing I know for certain. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Stay, not as their nanny, not as my employee. Stay. With us. With me. The words hung in the night air, fragile but powerful. Mariah's heart pounded. She had never expected this. She had never wanted wealth, never dreamed of love in a mansion. But standing there, with the man who had once been untouchable now standing vulnerable before her, she realized the truth. She wanted to stay, and for the first time in a long time, Edward Kingsley felt something stronger than power, richer than money, more valuable than anything he had ever built. Family.